As you've already heard, I've got a bit of a checkered background in terms of research areas. Hopefully it's in a positive way. But just to outline, I'm not a scholar of the Holocaust. I've never claimed to be. I'm very interested, and I do have a background in looking at the representation of the past on British television, particularly in factual programming, and to some extent in the press. I'm moving to look at how the past is represented in the British and Irish press, the Anglophone press. This paper also very much represents a work in progress in that respect. So, lovely. Okay, so to begin, British and Irish media in the 2 decades from about 1995 regularly positioned Sir Nicholas Winton, a British businessman from a Jewish family, active as organiser of the Kindertransport, which saved the lives of hundreds of Czech children in the late 1930s, as a British Schindler. Irrespective of the type of newspaper, so tabloid or broadsheet, left-wing or right-wing, the term was used to describe Winton from a few years after the release of Steven Spielberg's Schindler's List in 1993, until shortly after Winton's death in 2015. Now, elsewhere, I've suggested this was because the figure of Schindler represented, even for UK audiences, a well-known civilian hero, and the term British Schindler was a type of cultural shorthand signalling a range of positive attributes. Today, I'm aiming to provide a brief overview, necessarily brief overview, of pre-2015 representations of Sir Nicholas and other civilian heroes in the Anglophone press, before moving on to consider the impact of his death on later representations, both of Winton and of other Europeans involved in saving lives, predominantly saving Jewish lives. Most notably, Winton's death seems to have opened up a potential for women to be Schindlers, but only to a rather limited extent. For although British press coverage in the 3 years since Sir Nicholas's death has moved slowly away from the Schindler trope, allowing his achievements to be understood in their own terms, he's now become a key figure symbolising British civilian bravery, with few UK press accounts considering other civilians active in the preservation of Jewish and other lives. This is despite the UK government's recognition in March 2010 of 27 Britons as heroes of the Holocaust, including Winton, and the September 2016 launch of a competition to design a Holocaust memorial for central London. Initial research into the significance of Nicholas Winton to British memorialisation of the Holocaust revealed a number of surprising elements, not least that it was only after the massive success of Schindler's List in 1993 that his activities received sustained recognition. And I appreciate from talking to a couple of people yesterday that he did, and I knew this already, I've written about this already, he did receive some recognition in the 1980s through the British magazine programme That's Life, and it's quite well known. I think that's quite well known now, especially with clips being on YouTube now. But really sustained recognition he only starts to get in the 90s. Then he, and in the main other men involved in rescuing European Jews, were not recognised so much for their individual bravery, but for supposed similarities to another man, Oskar Schindler. As Tony Kushner notes, commenting on a BBC Radio 4 programme, Britain, Schindler, Nicholas Winton, of June 1999, Kushner notes, the canonisation of rescuers of Jews, labelled Britain Schindlers, suggests a desire to avoid less pleasant stories of British animosity towards Jewish refugees. Certainly, from the early 21st century, by which point Schindler's List had become synonymous with representations of the Holocaust for much of the British population, the UK media had begun to regularly use the term. Analysis of visual and print media depictions of Winton as a British Schindler suggests the term was particularly heavily used around the 70th anniversary of the last Kindertransport to leave Prague in early 1939. Kushner has commented in response to such representations that there's been an increasing tendency to seek out the moral giants in the bystander worlds whose actions either confirm the weakness of those around them or confirm that ordinary mortals could have done little to help. This is crucial to considering the representation of Nicholas Winton. Kushner's assertion that Winton was labelled a Schindler because, quote, market research revealed this is what the public wanted to hear and read, as it reflected the happy ending sought in much Holocaust memorialisation in the early 21st century, suggests that in Britain there may be a rather different response to the Holocaust to that of many other European nations, due in part to a very different experience. As Sharples and Jensen remind us, mainland Britain, not the Channel Islands, mainland Britain, did not experience occupation, meaning it's not had to endure the same painful, soul-searching questions as other parts of Europe. Newspapers were particularly keen to describe Winton as a Schindler, to the extent that in two of the most significant articles of 2009, linked to the 70th anniversary, his real name does not appear until the middle of the piece. It does, but only eventually. Both the Daily Mail and the Irish Independent noted the arrival of a train containing former Kinder and their descendants, which travelled from Prague to Liverpool Street Station in London, by reference to the British Schindler. Even in 2013, Rabbi Dr. Jonathan Romain, writing in the Guardian newspaper, offered his congratulations to Nicholas Winton on his 104th birthday, and used the term British Schindler, demonstrating his awareness of its ubiquity in the media, but also its wider significance to Britain's self-representation. In contrast, the Telegraph of the same year considered the experiences of the Kinder, summarising the Kinder transport in the words of Michael Newman, Chief Executive of the Association of Jewish Refugees, as, quote, uniquely British, and a response that other countries did not make. It is in the public discourse of what Britain did and part of our Holocaust history. I found it very interesting hearing today and yesterday of a number of nations who claim a unique history in that respect. No reference was made to Schindler or even to Winton. Instead, those on the transport and patriotic pride more broadly in British actions was being emphasised. Initially, it seemed as if this broader view, an emphasis on those being saved, an emphasis maybe more broadly on the actions of civilians, the actions of rescuers, might herald a move away from the figure of Schindler. And indeed, analysis of reports produced immediately after Winton's death does reveal a lessening use of the term. For example, BBC News coverage aired the day after his death didn't seek to link him to Schindler. One of the interviewees, Suzanne Medas, a former Kind, explicitly rejected on screen the suggestion that the two men should be compared, and instead she emphasised that Schindler profited by having Jews in his factory, whereas Winton, quote her, had no ulterior motive. Analysis of the following 3 years suggests a broader rejection of the sort of Schindler shorthand. The BBC documentary Children Saved from the Nazis, the story of Sir Nicholas Winton, broadcast in early 2006, was free of such terms, both in the title and in the lengthy press release, which is quite interesting. There seems to have been a real desire to reject it and forefront Nicholas Winton as an individual. This contrasts with the Channel 4 documentary Britain's Secret Schindler, which aired in January 2011, which likely used a reference to Schindler to attract viewers, as viewers using electronic programme guides, EPGs, are perceived by broadcasters to be very influenced by programme titles. Viewers would read, therefore, Britain's Secret Schindler first and presumably be intrigued by it, whilst they'd be less likely to recognise the name Nicholas Winton, at least in 2011. I think perhaps there's been a bit of a move more recently. I think the name is more recognisable now. So it's therefore significant that Winton's name did appear in the title of the 2016 documentary, suggesting less of a perceived need to reference Schindler when acknowledging humanitarian or heroic wartime activities. Winton had, I think quite simply, Winton had become better known, or was perceived by broadcasters to have become better known. Later references to Winton, that's just so you can watch the entire Children Saved from the Nazis online on YouTube. I don't have time to show a clip, but it is very interesting because the presenter is someone who was saved by Nicholas Winton and, of course, a host of other people on the Kindertransport. So I think it's quite interesting in that respect. So later references to Winton, including the activities of his family in the years after his death, are also revealing of the changing manner in which he and his legacy are remembered officially. Although reports of the 2016 memorial service, published by the London Evening Standard and the Independent newspapers, both British newspapers, did use the term British Schindler, and those in January 2017 on the planned memorial at Prague railway station, which is now excellent, which referred to the children's parents as another group of unsung heroes, again termed Winton a British Schindler, and in so doing seemed probably unintentionally to minimise the parents' role by positioning Sir Nicholas as the most important person named first in the article. Other references have been more circumspect, but before I go on to those, that's the image on the right-hand side, and I apologise that it's not very big there, but you can see the header, Children Saved from Nazis by British Schindler, planned memorial to parents, and literally the first image you see is of Nicholas Winton. So it seems that he subsumes other people, even though notionally the article is actually about the parents and remembering the parents, of course, and the children, of course, as well. So, for example, more circumspect examples, the Irish independence reference in May 2017 to the unveiling of the Prague Memorial offered some details of Winton's activities, but did allow him his own identity. They didn't call him a Schindler. Whilst unsurprisingly, the Jewish Chronicles report in 2016 on efforts to persuade the then Mayor of London, Boris Johnson, to name a street after Winton as part of the Europe-wide initiative headed by the Raoul Wallenberg Foundation, didn't use the term Schindler. So there does seem to be a pushing away from the use of the term. So to put this into a wider context, between the early 2000s, Sir Nicholas's death, it was very rare for the term not to be used in some way if he was being talked about. To reference a better known history, i.e. that of Oscar Schindler, for the benefit of UK readers, drawing upon a mythical, heroic figure seemingly transcending national and religious boundaries. But after Winton's death, although not consistently absent, the term Schindler has become increasingly rare. Most interestingly, in the years after Sir Nicholas's death, press reporting on his daughter Barbara's work has been quite revealing, and also the work of Sir Alfred Dubs, who's a former child refugee. He arrived in Britain on the Kindertransport as a small child, and his parents were murdered in the Holocaust. When in early 2017, Barbara Winton wrote a public letter to the Prime Minister to appeal against the closure of a scheme which was intended to support the movement of refugee children to the UK, and this had originated with Dubs, who was also a former Member of Parliament. Barbara referenced her father's humanitarian work, asserting that, quote, he knew that each and every one of us share a responsibility to our fellow men and women, a responsibility to offer sanctuary to those fleeing persecution. So moving from the Schindler trope to, unsurprisingly, represent her father as embodying a humanitarian spirit, currently lacking in British politics, she and Dubs may be seen to have been referencing Winton as an alternative to Schindler, not to reject Schindler's work, but to offer a very British figure of toleration in the face of increasingly negative portrayals of foreigners and other minorities in the UK press and elsewhere, particularly after the referendum of June 2016, actually frankly the lead up to and aftermath of the referendum, the aftermath of which has included a substantial rise in violent hate crimes against British Asians and against Eastern Europeans. However, even the left-leading broadsheet, The Independent, termed Winton a Schindler in the article's title, underlines the ongoing use of the term for Winton, occasional use, less frequent than it used to be, but it's still an occasional use of the term on some occasions. Tabloid newspapers limited reporting on Barbara Winton's works, because it was a broadsheet. It's now online, but it still has it's still, if I can put it this way, it's still a newspaper with integrity in that sense. Tabloid newspapers, though, rather more limited reporting on Barbara Winton's Barbara Winton's campaign suggests a desire to use the Kindertransport primarily as a signifier of British bravery in the Second World War, and not as a source of inspiration for the present. The Kindertransport as a source of patriotism does make sense in terms of UK tabloid journalism and its representation of British identity, whereas the Kindertransport as a sort of moral blueprint, for want of a better term, in later years, is largely ignored by those portions of the press who've been exceptionally negative in their portrayal and discussion of the young refugees, often representing them as, oh, they're not really children, they're adolescents, it's not really saving kids, this sort of thing. So it therefore seems appropriate to consider those also deemed to be Schindlers. Who else is considered a Schindler in the present? Earlier research suggested Schindlers could be of a range of nationalities beyond the British and Irish. This is in the eyes of the British and Irish press. Although they are almost exclusively male, despite the involvement, for example, of women in the Kindertransport. One exception, though, is Mary Elms, the quote Irish Quaker Schindler. All good. The Irish Examiner, Irish Times and Irish Independent all offered accounts of her wartime activities after Winton's death in the wake of Clodagh Finn's 2017 A Time to Risk All. That's another book, actually, I've got it there. An account of Elm's life and work with refugees in France, including children. Indeed, also in late 2017, Paddy Butler's The Extraordinary Story of Mary Elms, the Irish Oscar Schindler, unapologetically used the figure of Schindler as a metaphorical and literal selling point. Unsurprisingly, the Irish press were keen to fade the work of an Irish civilian active in saving lives. And although Winton was certainly reported upon during his lifetime in the Irish press, Elms may have replaced him as a Schindler. That Elms died in 2002 also perhaps removes the risk of a kind of hiatus. How do we continue to report about it? No, she's already dead, so in that sense you can have a kind of unbroken chain of reporting. Perhaps, it's a suggestion. Whilst Winton's death and the discovery of an Irish counterpart meant for the Irish press it was no longer necessary to refer to a British civilian hero. And we must remember the Irish press isn't just serving people in Ireland. Obviously there's a massive Irish population abroad in America, for example, and it's Anglophone, so a large number of people can read it. Ireland's neutrality during the Second World War has been questioned in retrospect, and historians like Claire Wills have addressed the decision to remain neutral, which was based in part on antagonism to Britain. So it's perhaps unsurprising that the Irish press reported on an Irish civilian hero, although as Irish, a Quaker and a woman, Elms is triply othered. And her absence from the British press, despite some coverage prior to Winton's death of other nation Schindlers, such as Albert Lillet, resistant spy and Spanish Schindler, reflects a change of approach, in which Schindler is relied upon far less in the UK, replaced by an expectation of readers' awareness of Winton's life and work. So drawing tentatively, very tentatively then, on John Barrow's model of national identity, which stems from his work on the 18th century, but I think, given some of the developments in the popular history represented in the British press, I think it could be useful, as I say, it's very tentative, John Barrow's model of national identity, outlining how the British view of other nations has historically centred upon Britain as this, whilst nations with whom the British might at various points consider themselves to have affinity as that, and those outside these boundaries are the other. It's possible to clarify Elm's absence, maybe. Applying Barrow's framework to the British media then, I propose that Oscar Schindler's activities in saving Jewish lives provided a model of that, with whom we, the British, might align ourselves. So it's kind of the reader implied within the text in that sense, in how the term Schindler is used, or was used, in reports of Nicholas Winton. So despite belonging to an enemy nation, I think Oscar Schindler is very much that. And Nicholas Winton, of course, can be firmly positioned as belonging to this, a heroic Britain. Mary Elmes, however, fails to meet the criteria. Although ordinarily the Irish might be positioned, or often were positioned, as sufficiently similar to be that, in this instance her gender, possibly also her religion as a Quaker, seems to other her entirely when viewed alongside her nationality. After the death of Sir Nicholas, who soon became the sine qua non for accounts of British civilian heroism, Elmes cannot meet British mainstream media's criteria for heroes of the Holocaust, revealing a selective view of the past which threatens subsequent remembrance, and it certainly threatens the remembrance of the rescuers, but also, of course, those who were rescued. And Sophia spoke yesterday about the impact of politics on narratives of remembrance, and I do think this is certainly the case here. So in conclusion, it seems therefore that just as it was initially perceived as necessary to create a British Schindler in order to offer an uncomplicated hero in parallel to Oscar Schindler, it also became necessary, especially after Winton's death, to omit other Schindlers from British accounts, even if the term was no longer used of Winton. This has problematic implications for Holocaust commemoration in the UK press. No longer focused on those still alive to give testimony about those who saved them, memorialisation in the UK press seems increasingly reliant on photographs and footage of Winton to accompany reports of events, albeit events attended by Kinder, which moves the focus from the victims of fascism to a man who, although undoubtedly a significant figure, he refuted parallels made between his work and that of Schindler, and in general, he sought not to be put on a pedestal. After his death, events and individuals have been simplified yet further to the extent that in many British press reports, Winton has been positioned as the sole necessary figure of civilian heroism, with the Kinder transport as the only significant non-military activity of the Second World War, albeit with a limited interpretation of its significance in the present. Thank you.